So, hello. I'm Mike. I'm from the US, living in Amsterdam. And I'm going to do a little presentation and then we'll have some questions and discussion on minstrelsy, which is a topic relevant to Lindy Hop. So, content warning, will contain photos and possibly some videos of blackface performances. If anyone is sensitive to that, can make choices that are good for you. Yeah, come on, sit down. So a note about this is that I'm not an academic. I'm not an expert. Does this go back? There we go. Yes. So I'm not a super expert on this. I've done some research and listened to other people on it and put together a presentation, but this is something that any of us could also do. Just so you know, you don't have to be an expert to learn about these things. Okay, so what were minstrel shows? So stage performances that were portraying negative stereotypes and caricatures of Black Americans. And as we know for Lindy Hop is a Black American dance, so it is relevant in this way. This is a little bit of an overview. We'll dive into more details. So it was songs, dances, comedy routines, and usually performed by white actors who would put burnt cork on their face to make their faces blackened. Also, minstrel shows, I didn't know this even being from the US. I did not know this for a long time. Minstrel shows were the first popular national form of culture in the US that kind of spread throughout the entire country that everyone knew about. And then also the first pop culture that the United States exported to the rest of the world. And I think now we kind of know US movies, television, music is kind of spreads around the world a lot. But this was the first example of that was negative caricatures of Black people. So this is a poster for a minstrel show. You can see the white actors and then their characters that they're going to portray. Just so you may have seen these around, but you can kind of get a little bit of an idea from that. So some of the characteristic things are not just the black makeup, but there's usually big red lips that are exaggerated, and I don't think they have it here, but often white gloves. And then here's another shot, a black and white photo of a very old troupe, and they have a banjo in the front, so they're going to do some music and singing. Okay, so then this is maybe long in the past. Why do we still care today? So, have you ever seen any blackface in a jazz dance clip? Any of y'all? Nobody, really? Okay, some people have. A few people. So, maybe we can jump over. Have any of us seen Day at the Races? It's the first clip of Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, which is a Lindy Hop troupe many of us know. Have you all seen Day at the Races? Some people? Okay, so we can skip ahead a little bit. So there is some lovely singing, and then eventually some dancers come out. And we're playing a video. Sorry for switching the sound. pause it there for a moment. Sorry, it's not my computer. Still getting used to it. So far there's no actual blackface in the clip. There are elements of it that are related to or inspired by minstrel shows. So when they do some of the kind of funny looking faces, this is very much in the style of minstrel show performances. So even though it's not actual blackface yet and there are black dancers in it, it's a white director, movie maker who is directing them. So maybe it wasn't their idea to do those faces, maybe not representative of what they would actually normally do, but they're on camera and there's a white director telling them what to do, so then this comes out. Later in the clip there is some actual blackface in it, which we can maybe get a little look at if it's in this particular version. Yeah, so you can see here. So you can certainly go and watch the whole clip yourself if you want. But the main thing is that as Lindy Hoppers, we want to, when we look at these old clips, sometimes we'll see actual blackface, sometimes we will see elements from minstrel shows and from that idea, and we want to be a little sensitive to that and understand what's happening in the context of the time. So that is one reason. Since at least many of us, as we get into Lindy Hop, we start looking at early dance clips. So another reason is there have been blackface performances and costumes in the Lindy Hop scene even this year. And then black dancers will generally feel unwelcome if they walk into a space and someone is there in blackface. That will usually not make them want to stay. And we all here love jazz dance and want to connect to and honor its roots. So the overall motivation is we want to create a community that is honoring and inclusive of black people and of the roots of the dance. And if we have blackface at our parties and festivals, that isn't great for that. So again, this is the overview, then we'll dive into a little bit more detail. So on the note of this is still happening kind of in the world today, so this is, I just kind of Googled, as any of us could, blackface in Italy, and this was one of the results that popped up. It's a comedian from 2017 who did a video with, again, the white gloves and the black makeup. And I think this one is about immigration, but it's certainly not only in Italy. There's still blackface happening in the Netherlands, where I'm living right now. It happens in the US sometimes. Yeah. So it is still a thing happening today, not just way long in the past. A bit more about the history. So generally, we kind of maybe know that in the history of the U.S., slavery, we think, was the institution of slavery was mostly in the southern U.S. Is this like a familiar idea or not so much? Kind of, somewhat. Okay. So it was, slavery also existed in the northern U.S. It was just outlawed earlier. Around 1805, the individual states in the north had outlawed slavery, whereas it continued in the south and the southern states were much more dependent on it for their economies. So the minstrel shows specifically started in the northern U.S., in New York and Boston, and then they spread around to all of the U.S., and then those performers got popular and they started going to England, and then from England to the rest of Europe, and then they went to British colonies and all around the world. So even South Africa, by the 1860s and 70s, there were blackface shows happening there, minstrel shows there. And then what types of venues? So large city theaters and opera houses. So you could think like a big venue in Broadway in New York, as well as like lots and lots of small theaters, taverns. Also grade schools, high schools, and universities. So in schools, when you have like a school show, children even would do blackface performances, would do minstrel shows, because it was, again, a very popular form of entertainment in the U.S. And then club meetings, so maybe if there was like a city club people, and they had an event, charity events as well. Then small local theaters and more. So basically anywhere you could imagine there being a stage show, minstrel shows existed there. And then so here's just a couple photos with examples that, again, I just got off of the internet pretty easily. So this is 1938, London policeman dressing up for a charity. And then here is a pretty famous US actor, Mickey Rooney, appearing on stage in blackface, 1941 on Broadway. Okay, so then the when. We've kind of touched on it a little bit. It originally started happening in the 1820s and 30s, so we're now in 2024. So this is 200 years ago, like 2 entire centuries. This has existed. I was looking around, there's some people will say it started even earlier in the 1780s and 90s in newspaper letters. So people would write into the editor of a newspaper in character in the same kind of way. They would write in as a Black American character, basically writing as if they were that person to embody stereotypes, negative stereotypes about Black people. So even earlier than that, so one person, and we have the video later, they called it literary blackface as a subcategory. But the actual stage shows started about 200 years ago, 1820s and 30s. So the peak of popularity, depending on who you ask, it was somewhere between the 1830s and 70s. And then there were professional people. So like this wasn't just some small local things. There were full troops of people touring the world doing these shows. That stopped around 1910 because vaudeville got popular, and then vaudeville kind of took over that part of the entertainment industry. And then amateur shows continued at least into the 1960s. So an example from the UK is the black and white minstrel show that was on TV, like primetime BBC, for 20 years. And then was also a 10-year running theater show in the 60s into the 70s at the Victoria Palace Theater. And then just a note here of the 2017 YouTube video from the comedian. So this is the cast of the black and white minstrel show on, this one was the stage show, not the TV show. And again, this is like the 60s and 70s so not that long ago. There's still like a full production of blackface, and it still retains the same makeup, the white gloves. It's very clearly this thing, as well as being titled The Black and White Minstrel Show. So what does this all mean? So I think there's many things that we could take from this. For me, I would say it's that a lot of the ideas we have about Black people are floating through the culture, and we may not consciously always be aware of them, but we have no doubt heard them in the air. It's a bit of like the water we all swim in. And being aware of it then helps us understand and notice those things, and notice if they have seeped their way into our subconscious. As well as, I think, understanding that history means if we're at a party and somebody shows up in blackface, we could maybe, any of us could go and have a conversation with them, and maybe they don't know, they haven't been educated. But yeah, it is that's deeply embedded in popular culture. Again, 200 years, even through today, and while it was came from the US, it's still exported around the world, and as we saw, the UK and Europe is still has been happening pretty recently, and is still happening sometimes in one form or another. So this particular picture is grade school children. So like at this point in their lives, they don't really know what's going on, right? I think we can agree at this point, like they don't know. Their parents, their teachers, whoever told them to do this, and so they're doing it. The point is that like this is how these ideas are passed on, is often in community, from parents to children, from teachers to children. It's not something that everyone comes to individually, or that people necessarily consciously like At age 25, they read something and then they're like, I now believe this. This is something instilled from childhood in many people. And of course, this is an extreme example, but because it's floating in the culture, it's something that we've all absorbed at some point in our lives in some form, to some degree. Just gonna turn that way. Maybe that is a little less feedback. Yes, okay. Yeah, so this particular one is from 1939, which again is long after like the peak of professional minstrel shows, but still happening. And this one is actually on a former plantation, Ashwood Plantations in South Carolina. Okay, so then why? Why did this exist? What was the purpose? Why did it gain popularity? Why is it still happening today, 200 years later? So the specific reasons changed a little bit over time with the context. So when in the 1820s and 30s, the kind of legal overt institution of slavery was still in the southern United States. It had been outlawed in the northern states, but in the northern states, somewhat in the south, but especially in the north, the abolitionist movement to get rid of slavery was starting to gain momentum. So as generally happens when there is a new social movement to change something, there will always be resistance to that. So minstrel shows arose as a popular culture form of resistance against the idea that we should get rid of slavery. So it's right around the same time, pretty much clearly as a reaction to it. So all of the stereotypes and ideas put forth in minstrel shows about black people are to justify slavery, to rationalize it and say this is something that should continue. So some of the specific things, there's generally the message, and I don't have examples, but in minstrel shows, there were several recurring characters that would be played by whoever was in that troupe. So one of them would be probably the best known one is Jim Crow, which is also the source for Jim Crow laws, which were the segregation laws in the United States through the 1960s. So that was named for the character Jim Crow, who was supposed to be kind of a buffoon, didn't understand what was happening, basically a comedic fool character. So that was like a common character. Another one kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum was Zip Coon, which was like a fancy black person dressing in nice clothes. And the idea there was that if black people are free, then they are a threat to white people because they will be they'll be doing better than the poor white people, and we can't have that. Or maybe they're going to look good in their nice clothes, and then white women will want to be romantically involved with them, and we can't have that. That was also the message. So kind of across the spectrum, the idea was black people are not individuals, they're stereotypes that we can reduce to these characters. So some of them were directly white people are superior and black people are inferior, which is white supremacy in a nutshell. And then some of them also, and you can see this a lot in early films, where the idea that black people are content being servants. So there'll often be another one of the characters was called a mammy, which would be like a sort of middle-aged black woman who's usually heavyset and is a servant for a white family. You may have seen this character type in various films. And so some of them, there was one film in particular where the white family got the mammy's pancake recipe and made it popular. And they were like, okay, you get all this money from this pancake recipe, you can have your own house. And the character's like, oh, but then who's going to take care of you? I don't want my own house. I just want to take care of this white family. So it's putting forth the idea that black people are just content being servants and don't want anything for themselves, therefore justifying segregation, keeping black people in a lower social class, etc. Okay, so we talked about that one. So another kind of social movement this intersects with is through that whole time the general labor movement. So like labor unions, people fighting for workers' rights. A lot of the labor unions were also resistant to having black members. And some of them did, some of them didn't. There's kind of a long history of that. But one of the things that minstrel shows did was put forth the idea that, like, even if you're a poor white person, at least you're better than the black people, and then you could unite with people against that, which of course for the upper class people means that you can divide the lower class people against each other and stay in charge. Keep your wealth and power. And then the last point here, I think, is maybe one of the more subtle ones, which is it's a way for white people to deny and kind of ignore the shame, guilt, responsibility, not just for themselves, but for their ancestors, of everything happening through slavery and afterward. And then also deny the need for change, because again, maybe while black people are dangerous if they're free, they don't actually want to be free, they only want to be servants, all of those ideas. And then we have just a little, if it'll play, we have a little video that breaks down a little bit of that history in film.
Unless they are buffoons.
There's a long history of grotesque, racist caricatures depicting black people as childlike, animalistic, or lazy.
There's a wild old man what don't do nothing but tell stories.
In order to justify slavery and the systemic mistreatment of black people.
When you mock or belittle us, you enforce an existing system.
Versions of these caricatures carried over into our earliest blockbuster movies and remained popular on screen.
If you don't care what folks says about this family, I do.
In large part because while black characters have always been a part of American films, black filmmakers and sometimes even performers tended to be excluded from their creation. If we look closer, numerous anti-black stereotypes persevere in some form to this day across our films, TV shows, and culture.
When Shonda Rhimes writes her autobiography, it should be called How to Get Away with Being an Angry Black Woman.
Here's our take on the history of black stereotypes on screen, where they come from, and how they still influence our society today much more pervasively than you might think.
Cops everywhere staring down the barrel of a gun at a black man don't see a human being. They see a caricature, a thug, a
If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified about all of our new videos. This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. It's like
And if we can come...
white families.
I don't know why we leaving Mouse's house. He been good to us.
Hardworking and loyal, the Mammy figure was painted as deeply devoted to her white family.
How am I going to take care of you and Miss Jessie if I ain't here? I's your cook and I want to stay your cook.
In The Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's 1915 white supremacist film, which is largely credited for the 20th century resurgence of the KKK, the Mammy character, played by a white actor in blackface, defends her master's home from Union soldiers, suggesting that she's so committed to serving that she would risk her life rather than seek freedom. Proponents of slavery used the Mammy to suggest that, far from being abused, black women were beloved and willing surrogate mothers to the families they served.
Massa Carey's coming!
Praise the Lord.
But historians have found little evidence to substantiate the idea that enslaved black women were even commonly working in the home, as the Mammy trope suggests.
Just hold on and suck in.
Due to the high price of slave labor, all but the wealthiest families generally limited their slaves to field work. Those slaves who were assigned to housework were likely to be light-skinned, skinny, and quite young, in contrast to the on-screen Mammy, who was almost exclusively portrayed as dark-skinned, older, and heavyset.
Who spends most of her time in the kitchen, but never seems to know what's cooking.
Aggressively desexualizing the mammy helped to conceal the fact that many house slaves, especially women, were frequently sexually abused by their white masters. Nevertheless, the mammy figure persisted on film and TV throughout the 20th century. In 1934's Imitation of Life, Louise Beaver's Delilah refuses her boss's offer to pay her for her pancake recipe, insisting that she would be happier to continue to work for and live with her.
My own house? You gonna send me away, Miss B? I can't live with you? Oh, honey child, please don't send me away.
In 1940, Hattie McDaniel became the first black woman to win an Oscar for acting for her role as a character named Mammy in Gone with the Wind.
Oh, now, Miss Scarlett, you come on and be good and eat just a little.
Over the years, more films and shows have explored the problems and emotional plights of black women who continued after the end of slavery to raise white children as domestic workers.
Well, someone has to look after those children.
Really? And where are your kids? Are they all doctors and lawyers?
But even modern films that are sympathetic to black rights can still perpetuate aspects of the mammy trope in their characters. While the maids of the help are shown to be unhappy serving white families, they still come across as noble servants, mainly celebrated for their selflessness and kindness.
You is kind, you is smart, you is important.
Arguably, the modern trope of the black best friend, too, can be seen as the partial descendant of the mammy, since this character's role is to constantly provide support and sometimes tough love to the white main character.
Sometimes I wonder what it'd be like to go to lunch with my friends and have them ask me about my problems.
The strong black woman trope, which we've discussed in a separate video, also portrays black women as using their apparently infinite strength primarily to help other, frequently white, characters. Celebrating black women for their selflessness and service,
the minute you started working here, she started getting better.
Creates a bind where black women feel they are not allowed to be selfish or need help themselves.
I think the superwoman syndrome is this suffering in silence.
The male version of the faithful servant caricature was the docile, pious, and extremely subservient Uncle Tom.
What does that mean? Feed the slaves.
I don't know what it means myself.
Ironically, this type originated from Harriet Beecher Stowe's extremely popular abolitionist novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which the devout Tom nobly chooses to sacrifice his life rather than sell out other runaway slaves.
Some of that, but I think it's So we're back on microphone. Yeah. So I just wanted to point out some of the kind of distortions of reality that tend to be there. So minstrel shows will, for example, specifically mock black people for being illiterate while they were forcibly denied education and punished if they would try to educate themselves. Or again, ironically, the idea that black people are lazy and don't want to work while they're forced into work, again, sometimes being worked to death or punished if they try to escape, all of that. And then the list could go on, but one I think that is worth noting is the idea black people are promiscuous and white people should be afraid of black people's sexuality. And the reality is that enslaved black people were sexually assaulted and on, forced to have children with people chosen for them, separated from their families and spouses. So it's again with the idea that it's kind of trying to ignore or deny the reality and create a fictional reality instead of that to move past guilt and shame or the need to make changes. So all of that is kind of the background for anytime we encounter blackface. Like, not everyone knows all of that history, but I think even if the person doing it doesn't necessarily know all of the history, it does carry that with it, and anyone who sees it and does know the history, it can have that impact on them. Does that make sense? Kinda? Okay. So just a couple of quotes. So this is Frederick Douglass, lived in the 1800s. So he specifically wrote, white actors in minstrel shows were the filthy scum of white society who have stolen from us a complexion denied them by nature, in which to make money and pander to the corrupt taste of their fellow white citizens. and then a current professor, and we can watch a little bit of this video as well. So here she's talking about more nowadays if people have blackface in their like Halloween costumes and that kind of thing. So she says people have a hard time. They're like, I didn't mean it that way. I was just putting on a costume. So she says until there is social justice and equality, there is no way to step out of that history. And then let's actually skip ahead for a moment. Okay. And on that note of equality, is a photo of Count Basie at a protest in December 1963. Which I'm just very curious. How many of y'all have seen this photo before? Yeah, okay. I'm glad to spread it around more because I found it one day and was like, Count Basie at a protest. Everyone should know this. So his sign reads, all we asked was equality and justice. Okay.
Drink Kool-Aid, eat fried chicken, eat watermelon, to dress like, gangsters, and the whole list.
African American stereotypes.
Right, exactly. The whole list of African American stereotypes. And that's really what the core and the essence of is. And I think that people have a hard time. They're like, I didn't mean it that way. I was just putting on a costume. I certainly don't link back to Jim Crow from the 1820s and 30s when I'm doing this. But I think until there really is, social justice and equality, there's no way to step out of that history. So you may think of yourself as an individual person doing something and stepping outside, but I think you're fooling yourself because you're really still part of this kind of paradigm that's trying to paint African Americans as unworthy and less than. And that's what's funny about the costume.
10-minute video, definitely would recommend it, worth watching. Okay, so some conclusion thoughts from me is if we want to honor and connect with the roots of jazz, it is a Black American dance. We can't have blackface in the community. But I think, everyone who comes into the community is from wherever they come from, and this specific thing has been around for 200 years. It's been all over the world, so maybe someone has absorbed that idea and then shows up to a party in a costume with blackface and they don't know. So it doesn't necessarily, for me, mean, well, we need to all tell them they're a terrible person. I think it means as a community we need to have an effort to educate each other. We should, each of us, take responsibility to then go talk to that person, make sure they understand. And, maybe there can be some larger scale effort as well, but personally I think person to person is really nice, and especially if it's a person who's from the same country. So with Europe, I'm from the US, I don't speak Italian. If someone came to an Italian person, came into a party with blackface, and they didn't speak English, I couldn't tell them anything. I would have to find someone who's Italian to talk to them, right? So I think the more it can be people from your own culture, from their own culture, the better it is. Before we get to questions, so one note that I didn't mention before, earlier this year in Torino, just a bit north, there was a carnival party, I think, where everyone comes in costumes. So there was a bunch of costumes, lots of them totally fine, and then there were some that were Aladdin-based, kind of dressing up as Arab people, and then there was someone with an African warrior costume with a painted face. So that sort of thing, again, is happening earlier this year. And there, in the Netherlands where I am, there's I think maybe more of the issues are with football players and the Sinterklaas holiday and all of that. But again, specifically in the Lindy Hop community, this is still happening now in some form. So again, I think if individual people can educate each other, that's great. And one thing I forgot to say about the dance in Torino is the event just posted photos on Facebook. So it wasn't it wasn't like a person came to the party and they didn't know and the organizers had no idea, and what, like they had a photographer there, they posted the photos publicly on Facebook, and nobody said anything. So like there were multiple points at which someone could have said, hey, this is not appropriate, but nobody did. So I think even though maybe some of us are like, obviously blackface is bad, we maybe still need to spread that through the community more. Okay, so questions and answers. Any questions that come to mind? If not, I have some prompts, but maybe we can start a discussion now. There was one person specifically who came in a costume as, I think it was an African warrior, and they had face paint including... Yeah, exactly. Right, everybody was wearing a costume. So it has different cultural roots, I think. But this is a bit the points in that I think she's making here, is that blackface, you can't really step outside of that root. Or maybe another way to think of it is, let's say if you were a black dancer who came to that party and you see someone in blackface, how would you feel about it? Do you think that would make you feel welcome? Do you think it would make you feel like not welcome? Yeah, I think they were Aladdin-themed costumes as well, which for me is also problematic in a maybe a little bit different vein, but I would also say that is something I wouldn't do, and could also link some videos about that as well. But yeah, I think like if we're going for a scene that includes especially Black American dancers, then it's something to consider. And I think something about the kind of like cultural differences from different countries is we're participating in an art form that's specifically from Black Americans, not just from African people or Black Europeans, but it's specifically from a Black American context. And so I think for me it's very important to take that particular context into account for our scene in Europe. Yeah. Other questions? No other questions? Okay. All right, so we kind of already covered that. So maybe to just expand a little bit on that. So I think something nowadays that people say a lot is like, well, why aren't there more Black dancers in our Lindy Hop spaces? And sometimes if you go out to related dances like house or hip hop, depending on where you are, you may find, there are more Black dancers in this city. They just aren't coming to the Lindy Hop scene. And there can be a number of reasons for that, for sure. But I think one thing to think about is if a Black person who's not a Lindy Hopper yet walks into a space and there's someone there in blackface, will that make them feel like, yes, I want to come back here and learn Lindy Hop? Or will they say bye and go out the door and never come back? Yes. And then if someone, again, comes to a costume party in blackface, what can we say to them? Because, again, they may feel everyone's wearing a costume. This is just another costume. They may have no idea of the entire history of blackface. And maybe if they did know that history, maybe they would say, I want to choose a different costume. I don't want to go anywhere near that. Right? And I think, if it were me, I would want to know that history so that I could make an educated choice. And then lastly, with this and similar issues, sometimes what happens is the only people to say something are the Black dancers in the community, and there aren't so many of them, which means then that if they're the only ones saying things, then that burden kind of falls entirely on a handful of people sometimes. So another reason that I would say is nice for all of us to take responsibility is that then it doesn't just fall on on the few black dancers. And I will say, just from personal experience, so one of my dance partners, Jamaica, is a black person from the U.S., and she, some years back, got into Lindy Hop and blues, and absolutely loved them, loved the music. And then she actually left the scene for a while, not necessarily specifically because of blackface, but other similar issues, and just fully left the scene for some years. And in the last few years has come back in, and there's still some issues, but she said specifically one of the reasons that she now feels more comfortable is because when she came to this is a local dance in the U.S., someone came and said something racist to her, and she talked to one of the organizers of the dance, and they took care of it, and she didn't have to deal with it herself. Whereas in the past, she would have felt like, oh, I have to do this myself. And then it's, in addition to someone saying something racist to her, now it's like, well, now she has work to do as well. So again, if we don't say anything, then we're leaving it up to only the black dancers to do it themselves. Which then maybe means they don't stay. Okay. Yes. Other thoughts or questions? It's been a lot of me talking. Nothing else? All right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you want to...
Yeah. Okay. About this last carnival, there was a party in Rome, and it was specifically written that blackface costumes were forbidden. So I think there's a growing sensitivity to this problem, and even though, for example, in Rome, I come from Rome, so I dance there. There aren't really probably any black dancers in the Lindy Hop scene. But still, I think so. It's not probably felt as a urgent problem, but still, I see in festivals like this one, we have a kind of a safe space, volunteers in terms of any problems related with racism or sexism or whatever. So I think there's still a growing sensitivity, even though probably in Italy it's not really happening so many times, because it wasn't really a cultural thing here, the blackface. I still remember when I was a child an advertising based on blackface for taboo. It's some sweet le taboo. I think if we Google it, we'll probably find it. It was a song because this taboo was a black sweet, black candy. So the whole ad was based on blackface. You also a black screen with only the mouths moving. Yeah. So there was, I think, it wasn't portrayed as a negative thing in that case, and we didn't have the history of slavery and our colonization in Italy, but we still have the same problems, more recent problems of immigration. So we still in parts of Italy and parts of our culture have the same stereotypes against black people, but they're newer to us, so it's a bit strange. So probably we didn't live that, so we don't understand. Probably an Italian white man who would think about a costume with as an innocent costume, but still, so he wouldn't know the history, but still, it's still. I don't know, follows some stereotypes that are still present in our culture, even though in different ways. So I think it's important to avoid this.
Yeah, thanks for the context of Italy. Yes, yes. You were going to say something earlier too?
Yeah. First, I want to thank you for giving this talk, mainly because I think that when it comes to these issues, like, it's really important to know, like, history and the context in which these problems originated, because even if, like, in Italy we don't have this kind of issues, or maybe we are starting to have them or something like that, if, for instance, in Turin someone does a blackface, and as that professor was saying, like, you may be convinced that you don't are continuing the stereotype, but if you don't know history and you don't know really what it does represent from some people, like, you are probably continuing the stereotype anyway. So thank you again.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that's why I'm not saying it should be like, we should look up who that guy was and like kick him out of the dance. No, it's more, I'm sure he didn't think anything bad of it, and for me it's more that if nobody said anything to him, it's the overall community, someone should have said something to him, right? And yeah, just again, it makes sense, we're on the other side of the ocean, but especially since we're specifically doing a Black American art form, it's good to understand that context. Anybody else? Nobody else? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming and listening and participating. And let's all so this can be a little intense to talk about, so let's maybe all thanks.
I want to say the last thing.
Yeah, can we just one second? If we could all stand up, take a deep breath in, and exhale. Yeah.
The thing I wanted to say is that all the money designated for this talk are going to the Black Lindy Hoppers Fund. So thank you, Mike, for this gift to the Black Lindy Hoppers Fund. Thank you very much. And the last two things I have to remember, siamo tutti italiani qui? Sì, ok. Allora, che non vi dovete dimenticare che ci sono i coupon all'interno di queste buste che avete avuto per la registrazione, in cui potete avere, insomma, coupon per lo sconto per la sartoria retro. E un'altra cosa ancora importante è che questo numeretto, questa sera e domani, dovete indossarlo, perché è un numeretto per la competition che avverrà nei prossimi 2 giorni, quindi ognuno di noi deve indossare questo numero. Se vi piace particolarmente qualcuno e il suo modo di ballare, vi siete trovati bene, prendete questo numero dell'altra persona che sarà appunto sulla sua maglietta e lo scrivete e lo mettete nell'apposita scatola che troverete lì vicino al palco principale, insomma. Quindi grazie mille, ci vediamo domani. Grazie Mike, thank you.